Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. It's Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 5th of June 2024. D-Day commemorations are being organised in a number of places. There are dignitaries from around the world landing in France at the moment to go and pay respects for those who gave up their lives on that very important day of the Second World War. This is going to be one of the last major commemorations of the landing where there will be survivors of the activities there. It is obviously the nature of time. Sadly, we'll see fewer and fewer surviving members of those who landed at D-Day, and the 80th is yeah, as I say, probably going to be the last major one. I was really kindly offered by Dell, who does the OneDrive statistics that loaded onto OneDrive, the Excel spreadsheet that I sometimes go through, and are always linked in particularly this first video of the day in the description below. He lives near me, and we're going to go out for a beer tonight, but I was unable to commit myself to walking around, getting on trains, walking around due to my mobility just at the moment is a bit worse than normal due to the fact I've been doing exercise. But anyway, I just wanted to show you, this is the MOD's little video, and here, that's where I live, that's where I would have been. Well, actually not the Millennium Tower, that's Portsmouth, Spinnaker Tower. There, I would have been on South Sea Common, walking around and listening to, I think it's Dame Helen Mirren was going to be there. And unfortunately, there was a Spitfire that crashed recently, practicing, I believe, for a flyby. And so the Spitfires aren't going to be flying by today due to that. But there was going to be, I think there's still going to be Red Arrows flyby and whatnot. Anyway, thanks Dell for that. And I'm really sorry I couldn't make it. It's a beautiful day as well. Absolutely prime for it. Right, let's go to our usual starting place, the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, and the caveats of course apply again today. You can find them in the description to the video below. 1,280 personnel lost, that's about the same as it was yesterday. 12 tanks, a tad above average. 16 armoured personnel vehicles, that's pretty much bang on average. 40 artillery systems, over double average there. So we can see where the focus for the Ukrainian armed forces is at the moment, although there might also be the idea that they're just, I mean, I have said this before though, that you can't have too many tanks lost in a day, because I don't think that there are all that many left. There are lots of claims, and I keep talking about this point as well, that attacks involve like a single vehicle, two vehicles. Long gone are the time is the time when they were attacking with, say, 30 vehicles at once. Now, there are some claims that the Russians are amassing vehicles. They're a bit nebulous at the moment, but it could be that we aren't seeing vehicles because they're stockpiling rather than they don't have enough. Well, they don't have enough because they would have been able to both stockpile and attack normally at the beginning of the war. They can't do that now, so have to take if they are going to do some large attack somewhere, I presume they are taking vehicles away from places in order to amass them for some kind of offensive. I don't know about the accuracy of those claims, but they are floating around. We'll I think talk about them in a wee while. 3 anti-aircraft warfare systems lost. 69 vehicles and fuel tanks is a high number there, and 12 pieces of special equipment likewise high. And it could be that 12 pieces of special equipment, I think both Ukraine and Russia will be losing excavators quite a lot at the moment, because they're both frantically building fortifications in light of potential attacks from either side. Ukrainians using a lot of excavators because of the panicked building of fortifications that they thought were in place but actually weren't, particularly in the north in Kharkiv, but also elsewhere they have been building fortifications for a long time now. So you will expect to see a number of excavators get hit fairly consistently. When we look at Andrew Perpetual's loss lists for the day, you can see another day of heavy losses for the Russians, but quite a lot of equipment for the Ukrainians. Those 3 purple ones are unknown which side, and then you've got a decoy at the bottom. So if you take that amount, it's probably about 1/3, just under 1/3 maybe, of the losses. That's fairly good. Obviously, we have seen much better than that, and that's what, as a pro-Ukrainian, you want. Sort of 6-7 to 1 is obviously brilliant. But today, about 3 to 1. Electronic Warfare Book of El, a piece of kit, and a radar, P18ML radar, another one of those, lost by a Lancet again. And that's what's going to be hitting, more likely, those sort of radars that sit further back from the front line. We also have some surveillance and comms equipment there. A boat being destroyed, a few tanks there, don't know what type. A couple of Marders. That's the first time I think we've had 2 Marders in one day, one abandoned, one destroyed. In fact, if you look at the IFVs, they are all destroyed or abandoned. So quite a high proportion of destroyed in today's list for the Ukrainians. Other than that, it's the usual culprits thrown in. They are going to hurt, losing BMP 1s and 2s, and some the odd APC and MRAP is going to be painful for the Ukrainians, no doubt. Just looking at how they've been lost, yeah, basically 3 Lancets in there, so maybe fewer than we have seen, but 2 tanks taken out with Lancets. So those tanks must have been somewhat behind the lines, which doesn't surprise me. I don't think the Ukrainians will be committing many tanks to the front lines at the moment, as they are mainly in a defensive posture. When we go up to the Russian losses, we can see an electronic warfare system, a Svet KU, and an OSA engineering vehicle, both of those damaged. We have a range of artillery, both destroyed and damaged, and then quite a list of tanks there, most of them abandoned or destroyed. We have a number of T-80s, T-80BVs, and T-80U there. Don't see too many of those at the moment. I think I saw some stats yesterday about T-80U variant being broadly kind of used up at the moment. That you don't see as many. They seem to have lost most of them. A couple of tracked garden sheds. We do see a lot of those on a daily basis. Those are the tanks with buildings put on top to protect troops that they are carrying, because I don't know, they have a lack of infantry fighting vehicles. I don't quite know why they are doing those to tanks, but they are. And then in terms of infantry fighting vehicles, they've lost quite a few. BMP 1s, 2s, 3s, BTRs, mainly abandoned and destroyed, so very few damage, only 1 damage there. Same for APCs, losing a lot of MTLBs, BTR as well, so on and so forth. Trucks, golf carts, and civilian vehicles lost in quite a large number. They've even included a bicycle on there. Night vision drone. Really? He says, really? Bicycle? Was it worth it? So you can take that. He's just put that there for, I guess, to make a point that they do target a whole range of things, but you could probably take that off in terms of working out a more accurate ratio. So that is that. The Ukrainians are doing fairly well. Russians losing quite a bit of kit, as we see on a daily basis. Russia is forcibly sending men who refuse to fight in Kharkiv Oblast to the front. Who refuse to fight, and they're sending them, among other places, I think, to Kharkiv Oblast. I reported this in my frontline update. Let's just quickly go through it. It's not a very long article. Euromaidan Press reports that Russian opposition outlet Vestka reported on the 3rd of June that Russian military authorities began forcibly sending hundreds of Russian service members who refused to take part in Russian combat operations to the front line in Ukraine, including to northern Kharkiv Oblast and Donetsk Oblast in May 2024. Now, I've shown you 2 videos. One was in Irkutsk, I can't remember where the other was, of Russian servicemen who had been injured and then had obviously recovered and were refusing to go back and have been locked up. And we had these various pieces of footage showing the conditions they were kept in and the fact that they were being kept. So these are kind of what are sometimes called refuseniks. And it shows you a number of things. One, that things must be bad on the front line for the Russians so that they refuse to go back there. 2, that therefore morale is very low. So the Russians are struggling, therefore morale is low, and the Russians are taking huge losses. And 3, the Russians are desperate for troops that they would just round up refuseniks, put them in a unit and send them into a meat grinder. And that's generally what the idea is here. So Versta stated that the Russian military holds the service members at military unit base points in Russia as they await trial for crimes related to their refusal to fight, before suddenly cancelling their trials and immediately sending them to Ukraine. So they don't even get to go through due process. They are rounded up, sent to Ukraine, to their probable deaths, as the Russian authorities refused to let them be tried. Verska reported that Russian authorities used physical abuse to coerce some soldiers into volunteering to go to Ukraine before forcing others from their holding cells at gunpoint and transporting them to their front lines. I saw imagery yesterday of a Russian soldier who showed basically his backside. He was showing sort of bruises he had, and he then pulled his trousers down, and his buttocks were just purple. He had just been beaten by a commander. And I think that was involved refusing to follow orders to go into, well, one would assume certain death. But others, obviously, you have barrier troops. So the Versa reported that Sverdlovsk Oblast Commissioner for Human Rights, Tatiana Merzlyankova, claimed on the 6th of May that she visited a collection point for service members who refused to fight, but that management stated that there was no violations of the service members' civil rights. However, Verska reported that, quote, Russian authorities cancelled the trials of at least 170 service members who refused to fight and deployed them to Ukraine, and that investigators, prosecutors and lawyers were all unaware of this. According to Verska, several sources, including one from the Russian presidential administration, stated that the Russian military sends conscripts and, quote, incompetent reservists who have signed contracts with the Russian MOD to non-combat roles in Russia's border force to free up experienced military personnel for the Russian offensive operation in northern Kharkiv Oblast, but that the Russian military is also sending deserters to fight. A Russian lawyer who specializes in cases related to service members refusing to fight reportedly stated that the Russian MOD may be stopping criminal cases to send such service members to the front due to a shortage of forces needed to fight in northern Kharkiv Oblast. Right. I did a whole video on draft dodgers, and there's a interesting legislation, or very important legislation, concerning the kind of conditions. So there's a difference between conscientious objectors who object to war from political, religious, moral reasons, right? So it's not that I don't want to go and fight because I think I might die. It's the whole principle of this whole war that you are asking me to go to, or trying to force me to go to, this whole principle is against my entire ethos. And so conscientious objectors can object to war on those bases, and they are protected by international law for that. Then you get draft dodgers, and you don't automatically get, for example, refugee status under this kind of international law by just going, well, I don't want to go and fight because I think I might die. But you can if the conditions sort of warrant it. So if you're asked to do things which themselves are kind of war crimey against humanitarian law. So if you were, say, for example, let's say that you're a Ukrainian man between 18 and 60, or 25 and 60, or whatever, and you were drafted to go to war, considering that the conditions appear to be fine for the Ukrainian, they're not fine, but they're not like against humanitarian regulation, and it's not absolutely terrible. You're not getting punished incredibly. You're not having barrier troops shooting you if you refuse to go forward. All those kind of things. It was kind of, let's just assume it's a regular war for these people. Then you can't draft dodge and hide behind international regulation in order to do that. I mean, it depends about refugee status in certain countries, but you get my general point. Go and see my video on this. It goes into a lot more detail and goes to the paragraphs in the international humanitarian law. And then we have the situation where, say, a Russian is drafted and they're put in a hole and tortured for whatever it is. Then they're beaten for this or that, and then they're sent into a meat grinder without the correct equipment to almost a certain death. So they want to refuse their orders, and then they see their colleagues or their comrades, getting shot by barrier troops. That whole setup is very different, and that's where you have, like, if you deserted from there and got to another country, then that kind of draft evasion, if you like, or that desertion would be, or if you'd evaded draft because that was going on routinely and you knew that and could prove that, then you would be entitled to refugee status more likely than someone who is evading just a kind of scare quotes, normal war situation. I mean, they're both horrific, right? But you get the point, is that there are different provisions depending on what's going on within those armed forces on a more, but the burden of proof is on you. You have to, give evidence to support that. It's not, you're not just automatically assumed. It's not automatically assumed that that is the case. You have to show genuineness of those factors. Right, anyway, I digress. Another failed Russian attack in Novomykolivka. This is one that came out that I saw yesterday. Not one I've seen before, so sometimes you can't tell whether these are just recycled. But it looks like there's another heavy loss of the Russians in Novomykolivka, which is down towards the bottom of the eastern front in Donetsk. Another failed Russian attack in that direction. Anti-tank mines, artillery shells, ATGMs and FPV drones left no chances for the occupiers. This is worth looking at just because of the use of all those things, right? It's really difficult to attack when you've got an established defensive position. This is for both sides, by the way. When you have anti-tank mines thrown out liberally, you've got artillery shells raining down, and you've got anti-tank guided missiles being sent from shoulder-mounted, whatever you call them, launchers. That's it, thank you. And FPV drones. So all of these things hammering an advance, you don't get very far, and indeed these guys didn't get very far. Now, just to talk in terms of aircraft losses here, or potential aircraft losses, the US has allowed Ukraine to down planes in Russian airspace since start the full-scale war, the White House says. So John Kirby's been on the podium saying, and speaking to the press ahead of Joe Biden's visit to France for the 80th anniversary of D-Day, Kirby said, quote, "There has been some confusion on the topic of Ukraine's permission to use US-supplied weapons to strike targets in Russia." Kirby clarified that there has, quote, "never been a restriction on the Ukrainians shooting down hostile aircraft, even if those aircraft are not necessarily in Ukrainian airspace." This is very interesting. So I don't know whether the Ukrainians got this wrong, or whether Kirby's got this wrong, or what. There are ideas that the Ukrainians shot down airframes in Russian territory with the German supplied Patriot back in last May in Bryansk Oblast, and that caused a lot of consternation amongst the German administration and in Washington as well. So something doesn't quite work out here, but it could be to do with the wording. So Ukraine, quote, "can shoot down Russian airplanes that pose an impending threat." And I guess the term impending threat does a lot of heavy lifting here. So does that mean they have to have shot first, the Russian airframes? Does it mean that they have to be on a mission where they are just about to shoot? Somehow you've got to prove that. Or can you just shoot down any airframe that is in some kind of zone that is a threatening zone? I'm not sure. So he says, anyway, Ukraine can shoot down Russian airplanes that pose an impending threat, and they have. They have since the beginning of the war. Yep, so they have done this. Bryansk is a great example, but if Washington had a go at them, if that is true, that might not be true. But the rumor is that both Germany and Washington had a go at Ukraine for doing so, and yet now they're saying, yeah, you've been allowed to do that since the beginning of the war. So there must be, I know this is supposedly clarification, but I think we need clarification of the clarification. Now, speaking of that general area, sort of Belgorod, north of Kharkiv Oblast, Ukrainian drones are attacking any energy supply across the border in Belgorod. Of course, this is with drones, not with US weaponry or Western weaponry, and this allows Ukraine to hit things that they'd otherwise probably get in trouble with a little bit for hitting. So substation, fuel tanks, etc., etc. The idea is to starve the Russians. So here we see, I think, a fuel tanker being hit. Then an electrical substation was hit in Belgorod as well. So things are being hit by both Gimlers, so guided multiple launch rockets into Belgorod, and also by drones, both military and infrastructural targets. Now, last night, in terms of distance munitions and whatnot, 22 out of 27 Shaheeds were shot down. That's not as tight an interception rate as we have seen, but it's okay, I guess. But still, 5 drones getting through. I don't know where they were aimed at. Talking about permissions again, it's an ongoing thing. I probably should have put this first. Several days of Ukraine pounding the hell out of Russian firing positions in Belgrade with no World War III on the horizon leads to new perspectives in security assistance. So there's the idea that since last Friday, when the US allowed Ukraine to use these weapons inside, or their weapons inside Belgrade and Sumy, the fear was, one would imagine from people like Jake Sullivan, a Russian escalation. And of course that didn't happen. I say of course because like, what can they do other than nukes? And they're not going to use nukes by just having a few S-300s blown up in Belgrade, right? So nothing happened. There was no escalation. And that has to teach the Biden administration something. That has to say to them, look, stop bloody worrying about escalation, because every time you've done something and you've done it late because you were worrying about escalation, no escalation took place. I mean, do I have to say it again? M777s, HIMARS, main battle tanks, ATACMS, and then, well, F-16s, and then here shooting into those Russian oblasts. Nothing's happened at each of those points. You've got to learn at some point that you can probably push the envelope quite a bit. And you can do that a lot earlier than you have been doing. So anyway, what John Kirby said again. So, I mean, I don't think it should come as a shock to anyone that President Zelensky would be grateful on one hand, but also eager to continue to press his case going forward. In other words, thanks for allowing us to use ATACMS. Thanks for allowing us to use guided multiple launch rocket systems and fire those missiles into Russia, but we really want to fire ATACMS and you're not letting us. Anyway, he continues, and so we'll have those talks and we'll have those conversations with the Ukrainians. Absolutely, we will. And whether it leads to any additional policy changes, I can't say at this point, but we're not going to turn our back on the Ukrainian needs, and we're going to continue to try to, again, evolve our support to them as the battlefield evolves as well. So this is the openness to talk about pushing that envelope even further, which is good news if you are pro-Ukrainian. It's not to say those talks are taking place right now, but that they will. If I was the Ukrainians, I'd be like phoning them straight away and saying, oh, right, okay, yeah, can we have the ATACMS allowed to be used into Belgrade? Because, man, we could smash some serious shit up. Stuff up. I don't mean to swear. Right, but I did. Russian-Ukrainian War Day 832. So Euromaidan Press on their daily update talks about, I think, a really important outcome of the US allowing Ukraine to use those munitions inside Belgrade. So Western permission for strikes inside Russia stops S-300 attacks on Kharkiv for days. In a strategic shift backed by Western allies, Ukraine's cross-border strikes on Russian air defense systems have brought a rare respite for Kharkiv, offering its residents a 2-day break from relentless S-300 missile attacks that have terrorized the city for months. Right, this is what really bloody annoys me. So, and I don't know whether Ukraine have some responsibility here, because the American defense is that, well, they only asked us 3 weeks ago. So I don't know if there's just a massive communication breakdown where the Ukrainians just assumed they weren't able to do this and therefore didn't ask, and the Americans are like, well, you didn't ask, we would have said yes if you had asked. And this weird situation. Or the Americans are just being a bit disingenuous here. Whatever the situation, right, you've had months and months of Kharkiv getting hammered by these surface-to-air missiles that nip over the border. You can't shoot them down in the air because they're ballistic trajectory. They're moving too fast and they're shot from so close that they just slam into Kharkiv. And these residential blocks are getting obliterated, and it's terrible. And Kharkiv's been under the cosh massively. And then in 2 days, effectively, 3 days, I think it is, they take out 2 days, 2 S-300, S-400 systems, apparently, and another radar system, and all sorts of other kit. There's a Tornado S, which is a guided multiple launch rocket launcher that the system that the Russians use, similar to the HIMARS. Just in a few days, they stop the Russians being able to hit Kharkiv. And yet, Kharkiv's been hammered for months and months and months. Get permission, stops in 2 days. It's absolutely infuriating. Why didn't that happen previously? Ugh. Really, really frustrates me. Anyway, sorry, tickly throat. Here we had, and I showed this the other day. This is Roman Gorilik, who's not even a soldier. He's a senior technician at a power plant in northern Ukraine after 2 years in Russian captivity. So this is how the Russians treat their POWs. It's an absolute, I mean, it's horrible to see that. Horrible to see. And there's your man there. His body is not in a good way. The Russians treat their POWs appallingly. The Ukrainians treat their POWs, it appears, exceptionally well, all things considered. And when you see these swaps, you see relatively healthy Russians go one way and emaciated Ukrainians go the other way. If that doesn't tell you all you need to know, then goodness, I don't know. I got into an argument with someone that used to write on my site occasionally, contributed to my site. He's gone down a very different political path to me, which is, I think really sad. And I said, it wasn't to do with that emaciated person. I just don't understand people who support Trump and Ukraine. Can't you see what he is like, etc., etc.? And it's this idea that Americans have a lot of issues. Ukraine is too far away. We don't really care about Ukraine. It's like, if you don't care about Ukraine, then why? What is If you don't care about Ukraine, that's fair enough. Maybe you don't, but there's an awful lot of politicians, an awful lot of people that do care enough about Ukraine to say we shouldn't be giving Ukraine X, Y, and Z, and then promoting pro-Russian, the pro-Russian narrative. And of course, like, this goes against, or it should go against, any motivation to promote the pro-Russian narrative, because by promoting the pro-Russian narrative, you're promoting this kind of activity, which means that you are sanctioning kind of morally dubious outcomes here and activity. And yeah, I don't get it. I don't get. Well, I do. You're just so deep in. You're so brainwashed. These people that it appears that you can defend the indefensible. Anyway, before I digress onto some kind of massive rant, let's move on. Frontelligence. So this is the idea that there is an amassing of Russian material and personnel somewhere. But Tatragami says Frontelligence Insight is documenting significant movements of enemy reserves involving hundreds of military vehicles of various types. This likely indicates that the Russians are preparing for another serious push. Russian offensive is likely to conclude soon. Unfortunately, I don't know where that is. There's absolutely no detail there, and that's a bit frustrating. But yeah, they could be amassing it in some location. And of course, if these guys know they are, then the Ukrainians will know that they are, and they will have plans in place. You would hope, although we thought that about Kharkiv, and Russians still managed to do some kind of surprise Kharkiv offensive. It wasn't a surprise. You knew it was going to happen, but the time and place was unknown. It seemed to catch the Ukrainians off guard. Well, hopefully, especially if they can hit within Russian territories, any amassing of troops and equipment will be principal target for the Ukrainians. Now, there are claims that down in Uruzhina, the Velika Novosilka sector, down on the southern front line, the Russians are doing another big push. Ukrainian soldiers reported about a new Russian attack attempt in Uruzhina. I don't know if this is just small and localized or whether there's something more to it. The direction of Uruzhina and Staromayorska became one of the hottest in the last month. Yesterday, Russians again tried to gather forces to storm our positions in Uruzhina, but the group was defeated 4 to 5 kilometers away from the front line. Russians lost 2 tanks and an infantry fighting vehicle. The enemy's personnel heroically retreated. However, the situation there is still difficult. But again, that's like 3 vehicles. But isn't it interesting that that's... Yeah, okay, they probably have more than 3 vehicles, but they lost 2 tanks and an IFV. This isn't a kind of 30 vehicles attacking that we would have seen previously, and that has to tell you something, as I keep saying. And then the propaganda tries to sell these sort of spin these different situations in a variety of ways. We've got Sladkov, who's someone I've referred to an awful lot previously, that War Translated often translates. So Dmitry here saying, masterclass of Russian propaganda from Sladkov. We're not advancing, but we are moving forward. We are losing people, but the army is growing stronger. We are being provoked, but we are not going on a summer offensive. Gazprom is almost bankrupt, but the economy is getting stronger. And of course, the problem is, this is what I keep talking about, that with the Russian Vranya and that BS that goes up and up the hierarchy to the top, and then these top decision makers make decisions on the basis of that BS. They then make bad decisions, but at some point, reality catches up, right? And you get a realignment of what you think, and that realignment with reality, because you can't exist for too long on a diet merely of BS. It's not healthy at all. And eventually you got to open your eyes and look around and go, oh, okay, we don't control the whole of Donbass. Why's that? Oh, we don't seem to have many troops left. Oh, we actually don't have 10,000 tanks. And so on and so forth. Like, you can't fool yourself the whole time. And this is kind of what happens. This is the result, is that you get a period where you're like trying to deal with reality, but trying to spin reality. And eventually it just becomes too far apart, the reality from your spin, that it slams back together. And then you have to go through that realignment. Now, talking about Gazprom, Gazprom badly hurt by Ukraine war, says a company commissioned report. Research ordered by the Russian gas group warns it may not recover lost export revenues for more than a decade. Okay, so Tendar, the German source, says no Russian company illustrates the Russian downfall better than Gazprom. Moscow once called the enterprise, quote, the first company being worth more than $1 trillion US, and at some point its growth rates were indeed excellent. But Russia's war of aggression against the Ukraine changed everything. Instead of hauling billions of revenue from European customers, Russians are hauling in hundreds of thousands of dead Russian soldiers. The outlook looks even more bleak, even according to the most positive prognostications. Big word. Russia will never be close to the profits it had before the war. China pays only a fraction of the previous European prices, thanks to China's dominance and Russia's absolute dependence on Beijing. The spare parts situation for Russian power stations and the energy grid is slowly but surely getting out of control for Russia. 75% of parts are produced in the West, and there are currently no programs to counter that threat. To the contrary, Russia's war economy is suffocating all other areas of Russia's industry. It will eventually lead to that Russia will produce less energy, with direct implications to the entire economy. It will get even worse for the Russian consumers. In order to survive as a company, Gazprom is increasingly looking to make Russian consumers pay the bill. What was unheard of before 2022 and even during Soviet times will likely become the new normal. Russians will have to pay normal market prices for energy. The unfolding catastrophe for Russia's bleak future is undeniable and obvious. It will have profound implications in the probability of the survival of the Russian Federation as a state which must have low energy prices or energy in general available in abundance in order to exist. With the Ukrainian drone strikes against Russia's energy infrastructure, this decline is also expedited. Putin has squandered the very foundation of Russia. Without any viable plan B, the cracks will get worse and the problems will accelerate. It is but another sign that Russia won't last a prolonged war, and that it is a Russia that is running out of time. Now, there have been lots of claims like this about Russia. You know, you look at Joe Blogs, the channel that often talks about how Russia's economy is really precarious, but it keeps going on. The question is if they are supporting all this with dipping into their reserves or artificial, I guess, economic moves and actions that prolong this state it's in at the moment. How long can those reserves last for, or what are the ramifications of those economic activities that prop up, say, the ruble here and whatnot? At some point, Russia could come crashing down. I think that's what a lot of people are waiting for. So there has been doom and gloom reporting for 2 years, and yet here Russia still is. But of course, they've gone onto a war footing. They've isolated themselves to a large degree. They are increasing their GDP by producing a lot more stuff. But that stuff is war material that gets sent to get blown up. So it's not exactly particularly sustainable. So on and so forth. Where's this all going? And however you look at it, Like, Russia is in trouble. It's not looking healthy. At some point, it has to sort of fall apart. And Gazprom, I think, is quite a good reflection of how things are. They made a loss for the first time in a very long time this last year to a massive degree. And the Russian state have said that they're going to put taxes up on Gazprom. You like kick a dog while it's down. Yeah, it's. I think Russia is in a precarious position, but then we have said that an awful lot. Okay, here's a Ukrainian soldier, despite losing his leg in a war, insisted on returning to training and defending his homeland. Ukraine and its people deserve safety and peace. Continue supporting Ukrainian people and their army, says this source. This is pretty good here. He looks pretty mobile. I'll tell you what, damn sight more mobile than I am. I mean, he can run, he can kick drums, he can shoot guns. So, yeah, if you want to go back to the front line, absolutely. He looks far more mobile than some of the soldiers I have seen. Obviously, they are having to mobilise from very much older age groups as well that are no doubt less mobile than he is. So, yeah, good luck to you, and amazing courage to want to go back to that. War translated Dmitry again says Russian citizens have lost $2.8 billion to phone scammers in 2023. Deputy board chairman of Russia Sberbank Stanislav Kuznetsov says the situation is critical and that Ukraine has 300 to 400 call centers focusing on scamming Russians, making 20 million calls per day at the average rate of one successful scam per 200 calls. Okay, I don't know how true this is. This is the Russians blaming the Ukrainians for scamming of their own people. But it's stuff like this that makes my brain go into it overheats, goes in. I work overtime on this. So on the one hand, it's like, oh, so assume that this is completely true, right? Ukraine have got up call centers to phone into Russia and scan the Russian population. On the one hand, I'm like, I feel uncomfortable about this because it is committing a crime. Like, scamming is a crime, and it's extortion or whatever it is. You are effectively stealing money from civilians. So on the one hand, that is a crime and that's bad, and you shouldn't do that even though you're at war. But on the other hand, on the front lines, people are shooting each other in the face. Like, well, that's a crime outside the war context. In the war context, it becomes an acceptable thing to do for your own survival. You do these things so that your country can stave off the invasion. So I guess it then comes down to, is it okay to hit, say, civilian infrastructure? Is it okay to bomb? So we're talking about shooting people. Okay, how about shooting civilians? No, that's not cool. Okay, so maybe that's a false equivalence, like the shooting compared to scamming. So can we... And this is where things like hitting energy infrastructure is in that real grey area in the middle, which is where hitting energy infrastructure can be argued that you're harming civilians, but also it's the ability for your industrial military complex to work. If you're attacking oil refineries and whatnot, then the fuel that the army uses to fly its jets and drive its vehicles is being affected, and so on and so forth. And you get that's okay, we can argue either way on that, but then scamming the civilians to then denude them of their money so that the economy's worse, and then the country falls apart more, and that precipitates the end of the war more quickly. How do I feel about that? This is what's called moral consequentialism, which is doing a bit of bad for a greater good, and that effectively makes that bad a good because it is a means to an end. So you're doing this bad, but it's necessary to achieve this good, and so therefore the evaluation of the bad is changed to good because of the consequences, or at least in the larger outlook of the moral evaluation. And that's not to say that moral consequentialism is the only way of doing morality. Of course, there are many ways of doing morality. In fact, no moral philosopher agrees on, well, there has been no consensus on moral philosophy for 3,000 years, which is why I think morality doesn't exist out there. It's not objective. It exists in here, and we have to argue about it with each other. And it seems to be self-evident. It seems to be self-evidently true to the point of fact that there is no prevailing moral value system. Okay, so all that aside, and I could bore you for a long time on morality, but it means that I have to sit there and work out how I feel about something like this, which is harming Russian civilians, I assume, as part of the war effort. And then I wonder if they're then scamming that money. I mean, again, there's an awful lot of ifs and buts, ifs here. Like, is this actually true at all? Right, and then what are the Ukrainians doing? You know, if they are doing that, is that money then going back into allow their country to operate? It's a form of, you know, paying repayments, if you like, for the destruction caused by the Russian state. And of course, if you're looking at the big picture and saying, right, after the war's over, Russia needs to repay Ukraine to fix it back up, then that money comes from the Russian state, which means technically is coming from those people anyway. So the whole notion of demanding an entire people's pay back for the destruction to this country necessarily entails that money not being able to be spent on those people on behalf of the state. Now, it's a bit of a kleptocracy anyway, and an oligarchy, and there's unlikely a lot of that money would find its way to those people. But in principle, you get the point. And so there's so many sort of moral arguments flying around here. War is a tough old subject to try and work out and muddle through in any kind of with any kind of moral clarity. Let me know what you think. Those are ideas. I'm sort of stream of consciousness spitballing that. But it does strike me as somewhat uncomfortable, but I can also argue for it as well, morally speaking. But again, might not be true at all. It's coming from the Russians. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your support. Take care. Speak soon.